Okay, so hello to Jan. Thank you so much for being here to this little policy chat from Brussels to the US. It's very nice to have you. So I will first introduce you a little bit what I would call your cursus honorum, I would say. So Joan O'Hara is the Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the XR Association in Washington, D.C. And she graduated with JD with honors, so cum laude from the New York Law School, and she's working right now in immersive technology, but she has really an outstanding career in DC when it comes to outreach and engagement, but also national security, working also on the White House, if I'm correct. So I think
Yep.
it's also very interesting because in a way, I mean, I'm not on the same level as I'm a young professional, but also my career as a researcher started more on the security side, and now I'm going more towards technology. So I'm very happy to have you. Please introduce yourself with your own words, because this was just a little bit overview.
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you in this conversation. I think it's an important one. To give a little more on my background, as you said, I'm Senior Vice President for Public Policy with the XR Association. We are a trade association focused specifically on immersive technology. So we have many of your big tech players as members: Meta, Microsoft, Google, Samsung, Sony, and others. But we also have solution providers, other people in the ecosystem like Qualcomm, for example, as well as developers, other types of platforms, and some end users. So we really cover the range, and we're very proud of that. We think that as this technology is taking shape and as the policy around it begins to develop, that it's important for everyone to have a voice. So it shouldn't be just your multi-billion-dollar companies, but we have some member companies who are as small as 1 or 2 people who are developers or creatives, and we want everyone to participate and influence how immersive technology goes forward. So that's a little bit more about XRA. As far as my background, yes, I worked at the White House prior to XRA in the national security space. I was the executive secretary of the National Security Council. So essentially, I was the chief operating officer for the NSC, which is a part of our government that brings together the interagency. So any agency involved in national security, like the CIA, the Homeland Security Department, the Treasury Department, et cetera. Anyone involved in foreign policy and national security is part of that group, but it's run out of the National Security Council. So I brought those agencies together around particularly important decisions on U.S. policy. Before that, I served as the National Security Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence. So again, national security focus, but a lot of really on foreign affairs and foreign policy. So it seems like quite a shift to move into the technology industry, but technology has a lot of implications for both national security and economic security. We really believe that immersive technology is going to be the next computing platform. And if it is, it's going to have a big impact on the way we do business, the way we learn, the way we socialize, the way we manufacture, plan, doing product design, urban planning, et cetera. So it really has implications across all sectors. So this, I think, is a very important issue for all the countries around the world, and that's why I'm particularly interested in discussing with you the way that the US and other countries can work together to make sure that this technology not only fulfills its promise, but does so in a way that really respects human rights and individual privacy and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think what's really interesting about your background, and in a way, a bit what brought me to this research, is that security oftentimes it's like the place where innovation come from. Like
Yep.
not maybe recently not so much, but historically is there. Like the reason to innovate often stems from the reason to protect national or strategic interest. So I think maybe if it's not so visible, the common variable among like technology and security, there is actually a lot of similarities. It's a very
Absolutely.
innovative sector.
Yeah, it's you bring up a great point, and things have changed. You know, in the old days, and you know, in decades past, a lot of innovation came out of military interests. Even the internet itself originally started as a way for government agencies to communicate with each other. And there are countless examples, especially coming out of World War II, where technology that was developed for the war um, had commercial applications, and so then they adopted it to apply to, you know, private sector individuals. Um, in the last few decades, however, there has been a shift, and it's a little bit working the other way, where entrepreneurs and you know, tech folks working in their garage or what have you, doing their coding, come up with really game changing innovations, and they're developing it because they love the challenge. They love computer science or what have you. Um, but a lot of these technologies that they develop can impact government operations, military operations, etc. So it's been interesting in the last few decades to see how that has shifted a bit. And something I think we'll get more into, but in terms of funding, where in the earlier days, a lot of the funding would come from the government to develop these applications for commercial use or for government use. These days, a lot of the funding comes from private equity, venture capital, et cetera, that these entrepreneurs are applying for. You know, it's important to have government incentive as well, but a lot of what's happening in technology right now is funded by the private sector.
Yeah, and you're bringing up a great point also when it comes to venture capital. I think I will save this for later. I wanted to just introduce briefly how we came up with the idea of this meeting. So we know each other since AWE 2023. And I think at the moment that we met, I was not yet fully involved with the Charlemagne Prize. And as right now I am the fellow for the year 2023-2024, I wanted to introduce a little bit also for the people that will watch this, what the Charlemagne Prize Academy is about, because it is born from the original Charlemagne Prize, which was awarded to not just to Europeans, but to also the American Secretary of State Kissinger, for example, and to Pope Francis more recently. So to personalities that helped um, shaping the future of Europe, but not only European personalities. And out of this prize, they decided to have a project that was more academic. So they already have a project for young Europeans having ideas that can help European integration. And aside to this Europe Youth Prize, they decided to support young researchers in Europe, which, to be fair, often they're a little bit not stuck, but I would say that research in Europe is often more, it follows more of a conventional path. Like people often get PhDs. I would say that fellowships are something that are not so common yet in Europe. And they decided to give this 1 year of funding, which is something I think is also very agile, because in 1 year you get to work on a topic, but not it's not too long of a time frame. on a topic that has to do with the future of Europe. And so it has to be something that is innovative. So they have been doing this for 5 years now. And when I applied, I realized that nobody had applied yet with a project dealing with immersive technology or the metaverse. And I wanted to propose it, but I was skeptical because I felt that maybe there wasn't so much attention in the policy world in Europe around this. So I thought, I'm not sure that right now I will be taken into consideration. And I have to say that thanks to the vision of the people of the academy and their team, they actually supported it. And they're supporting a lot many other projects that are very innovative. This year there is a project also on oceans, for example, one on the conflict in the Middle East. So I think, and all of them, what they have in common is that they're tackling this issue in a very unique new way. And I think that for Europe, it's very nice to have fresh new ideas. For me, the um, the epitome of like fresh and new is technology. I mean, for somebody else, maybe it's different, but um, I think I will go back to what you were saying. Sometimes I think the reason why in Europe there is more of a set path that is followed by people is also because we have a more not just traditionalist approach, but less flexible environment. I think looking at my research so far, focusing on immersive technology, but also private and public collaboration, what I noticed is that comparing Europe and the US, of course, the US is has less of a public infrastructure than we have, which it has drawbacks, but it also has incentives when it comes to having people starting their own ideas. And I think that what you were saying about, for example, the role that a private sector is now playing in funding new ideas, it's really key in this sense, because Europe right now has as perhaps a lack of VC, or it's not as on the same page as the US when it comes to VC. So I would really like to have your point of view on how vital are VCs in supporting the emerging tech scene in the US, with a specific eye on the immersive technology industry, because I think this is really important.
So it's over to me now.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, I think, typically, fairly or not fairly, I guess, Europe has a reputation for being almost overly cautious when it comes to regulation that is to protect individual rights, privacy, prevent harm, etc. And while that's certainly done in the right spirit and is important, some commentators would say that the regulation really hampers innovation and risk taking, and that people from around the world, not just Americans, will come to the US to continue their research and development on technology because it's an easier environment to be able to take those risks and see what works and what doesn't work, and experiment a bit more without running afoul of regulation, for example. Recently, over the past couple of years that I've been talking with folks over in Europe and participating in panels, talking to government people in the EC, the EU, and in the UK as well. It seems like there's been a bit of a shift, specifically with respect to immersive technology, to not come down with such a heavy hand, and to maybe give a little more space for risk and some mistakes to be made, and kind of see what develops before almost acting preventatively to protect against harms. I guess what I mean by that is Europe already has the GDPR, the DMA and the DSA, which are really important and novel initiatives. It seems, at least from the folks that I've talked to, that there's more openness to seeing how those regulations will impact immersive technology before trying to come up with new regulatory schemes. So you already have these very powerful schemes, on the books, so to speak. How will they impact immersive technology as it's rolled out? Maybe they cover everything. Maybe there is no additional regulation needed. Maybe there are some gaps where immersive technology specific regulation might be needed. But it does seem, generally speaking, at least the impression that I've gotten from my conversations, is there's a bit more openness to letting immersive technology flourish a bit more, rather than thinking of sort of like all these worst case scenarios and we need to regulate to prevent that before we kind of see what happens in reality. Through my research, we have discovered that Europe seems to be thinking very bullishly about immersive technology as the next computing platform and wanting to be the leader in that space. So, over the past couple of decades, the United States has really been the leader in terms of social media, the internet, technologies in that realm. And the EU feels, to some extent, you could correct me if I'm wrong on this because you're from the European community, I'm not. But the EU seems to feel like this is an opportunity to really be a leader in the next immensely important technology. And so they want to run with that, and they really want to do what they can to ensure that Europe has has laid the groundwork for success in that regard. So that seems to be impacting their perspective on regulating, over-regulating versus creating an enabling environment for the technology. And that it seems to be a bit of a different approach. I don't know if that's your perception. There are different opinions out there, but that's kind of what we have been picking up on.
I think maybe my perception is more like that Europe has a certain advantage because of the way because of our values, but also because of the advantage that the public sector has in Europe. Europe has an advantage, I think, when it comes to immersive technology, to its application to specific sectors such as education or health that are more that are closer to the public. And so I think Europe probably is not trying to in a way, I think, compete with the US, but more to be compatible with the US, if that makes sense. Because what I see from the technologies coming from the US, those are more like not just gaming, but in general, they're sort of like helping you to do things in everyday life that are empowering, but they can become like almost gaming, like that it's a type of extended reality that it's really maybe something that wouldn't be adopted completely in a public sphere, but rather bought by users, which makes sense because I think those are kind of technologies that are made by companies to be sold for people to be used in their everyday life. While what I see in Europe is like a tendency from European companies to produce things that are perhaps can be used by citizens in hospitals or can be used by citizens in school, and they're not like something that maybe you would use the entire day or you would take home. It's something that has more specific usage. That's my perception. And I would say that that's where the regulation in a way needs to be heavier as well, because when you do something for the public good or the public interest, you need to have that type of approach. And when you need to do something more like for the citizens and the private, you can try out like different things, with the only difference is that like citizens in the US are different than citizens in Europe. And so I think sometimes American companies, when they come to Europe, maybe they don't it's not they don't have the full understanding of how the European institutions view their product, but maybe there's also a gap in understanding when it comes to citizens, because there's a difference like sensitivity. So maybe that is the difference. But at the same time, I think the products that we have here are really not like a competition, but more like a completion of what the US companies are doing. And this is why I really think that working together from the two sides of the ocean is really important, because at the end of the day, if immersive technology remains a conversation that stays niche or stays just for a few people, not even in policy, but in tech policy, both companies in Europe and in the US, whether they do things for the public sector or the private sector, they're going to suffer from this. And so I think the first thing to do is to reinforce this type of collaboration. And once this kind of conversation is set, then there can be like adjustments. But I think the first thing to be done is this one.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's so important that we're working together. I think US companies have something to offer. Especially the big tech companies who are pretty much the lead in the hardware for immersive technology, and some of the other platforms. But there's a lot of imagination and a lot of really cool stuff happening, especially on the creative side, I think, in Europe. Um, but and this is why I think it's so important that we are working together, and that hopefully our policymakers will work together. Because what we don't want to see, or what I don't want to see, is totally different systems on two sides of the Atlantic. We've seen with social media and regulation being different in parts of Europe, where, for example, Meta is like constantly facing lawsuits and paying fines. Recently, about a month ago, I guess, Apple said that they will not put their new AI system on the market in Europe because the regulation is just too heavy-handed for them. I would not want to see things go in that direction where US companies are like, you know what, we're just not going to tap into the European market because their regulation inhibits what we want to do. I think there's all of this, and especially in immersive technology, will find the best result if all of our companies and our best minds are working together. So that's what I'd like to see. But I think now is the time, really, as this technology is not ubiquitous, before it becomes ubiquitous, that we talk through how regulation should work, how it impacts both individuals and the private sector companies, how it impacts public services, as you said, how governments want to use it. That's another point you raised that I think is a bit of a difference between Europe and the US. I think Europe thinks in terms of public services right out of the gate, whereas in the US it tends to be the government is sort of lagging behind on uptake with a lot of this stuff. So it's a lot of the new technologies come to market for private sector use, whether that's in industry or in commercial use before the government adopts it. Whereas in Europe, you were talking about thinking about immersive technology and its potential for public services. I think that's a little bit of a difference in the way that our societies work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in my perspective, this is really this comes from our history, like the way we arrived here. Like I think America has always been the place of like freedom and trying to assert your independence more than Europe, while Europe has always been more about traditions, and in the 20th century specific, also given the proximity to the Eastern Bloc, we developed a heavier, I would say, bureaucratic structure. That is my feeling. And so I think in a way the results of my research about collaboration, which basically says that if you have an innovative idea, the best way to make it come to life is to maximize collaboration between the private and the public sector. I think this, like the public sector and the private sector, in a way, could also be replaced by the US and Europe. Like the best way for a young innovator in Europe or the US for their idea to come to life is for the European and the US market to maximize their collaboration and institutions, because it's very unlikely from my point of view for an American innovator or a European innovator to make it on a large scale if they fail in one of these two markets, or if they fail in understanding the priorities of the institutions in one of these two regions. And that's the issue, because my main question was, a lot of people think, why do you want to be interested in the metaverse, in immersive technology? Like, do you think this is going to succeed? And my answer to the question was like, to be honest, I don't know, but I want to understand why some ideas succeed and some others don't. And I think that it's not really about the quality of the idea most of the time. It's about how accessible that idea is to people with different approaches. And that idea has to be accessible from different culture, like from the European and the American culture. And it has to be accessible both for people who want to have profit and for people who want to gain some type of political consensus. But what I also figured out in a way is that even though and this, I know you got to know about my idea before, but the general idea is, like, as Nash was saying, basically if you play nice, this is going to be beneficial for everyone. So even though the underlying like perception is that a businessman or a businesswoman wants to make a profit, and like an institution or like politicians, they want to get consensus. At the end of the day, if the focus of is innovation, neither of them has anything to gain from like essentially killing an innovation from happening. Like their final goal is for an innovation to be adopted in a way that is useful for people, whether they're seen as citizens or as customers. The same way for like Europeans and Americans, like none of the two have any type of interest in like being left without something that could have helped them, if that's something innovative. So the final objective is innovation that works for people, whoever these people are, whether they're like working in the private, public, Americans, Europeans. But I think sometimes when there is sometimes there is no dialogue about this, like this topic is not so talked about so much, in my opinion. And second, sometimes when there is dialogue about this, the focus is too much on the mean that the people involved have, like, is on the profit or on the political consensus, or maybe the difference in values between Europe and the US, and not on the final goal, which is innovation. And in the case of emergent technologies or the metaverse, like if the metaverse fails, for example, like nobody is going to be, I think, nobody will feel a winner. Not politicians or like people working in the industry, no Americans or Europeans. So I think this is really the core, and even starting with like chats about this, like online, as we're doing, is it's really important. And also with the work that you're doing, you were telling me before about the recent work that you've been doing on competition. So I would love to maybe know more about that.
Yeah. We spent most of last year, 2023, conducting research into the way various governments are approaching virtual worlds and XR technology. Because we had to scope it somehow, we focused on 5 jurisdictions: the European Union, the UK, the United States, South Korea, and China. And we did a very detailed deep dive into the way they're creating what we call the enabling environment. So are they laying the right kind of groundwork for this technology to flourish and be adopted and be successful? Part of that involves regulatory schemes. You know, how burdensome is regulation? Does it allow for risk taking, as I said before, or does it, or is it overly cautious? Is there funding? Is the government providing funding to both private sector and to, you know, government agencies to do research and development and try and bring this to market? What does public trust look like? Does the general population in each of these jurisdictions have a favorable view of technology, and especially technology in this realm of communications, which is ultimately really what XR is about? Do they have a vision for how they want immersive technology to impact their communities, their government, their way of doing business, their way of providing public services, their way of educating young people? Do they have a vision for the role that this technology will play? And within those 5 jurisdictions, there were strengths and weaknesses in each of them. But for the most part, China and the European Union seem to be the furthest ahead, obviously coming at it from very different perspectives and having very different approaches to that, where, you know, in China, the government really controls the private sector to a large extent. In Europe, it's not that way. But Europe and China seem to be doing the most to advance the technology and give it a good chance of success. Unfortunately, the United States was last among those 5. What the US is doing well is putting money into research and development. You may or may not have heard of the Chips and Science Act from a couple of years ago. It was a really big landmark piece of legislation that passed both chambers of Congress and was enacted. The idea behind it was really, it grew out of competing with China, who we would view as trying to sort of usurp the United States as the most powerful economy. There's a lot of concern about that among lawmakers in the US. And one area in particular where we feel like the US was lagging behind was in technology and innovation. And we wanted to not only make a statement about how important that is, but really put some dollars behind that. So this Chips and Science Act was the result of that conversation. And it provided funding for a lot of government institutions to do research and development in all different areas. if you look at the bill, it lists what they call the key focus areas. So there are 10 technology areas where the government wants to channel the funding. And one of those is immersive technology. Thanks to me, no, but thanks to XRA, because we did lobby the House and the Senate to include XR in that list because we think it's that important. Anyway, we were successful. So XR is in that list alongside of other things like quantum computing, biotechnology, basically the emerging technologies that will define our future. So that's a really positive step. But all of this is to say there is government funding going to research entities, also to universities who get a lot of government funding to conduct research and development on their own. But the US does not have a vision in the way that Europe has expressed it. The actions that China has taken to sort of lay out their vision, South Korea and the UK as well. US lawmakers are still relatively uneducated when it comes to XR, which is part of what I do as I go and actually meet with these folks and describe what the technology is and its potential across various sectors. It's not exclusively a gaming technology. In fact, it's mainly not a gaming technology. The impact will be in areas like healthcare, education, manufacturing, public services, even in environmental mitigation, those types of things. So educating them to understand why this technology will be transformative is step one. But then once they understand that, to coalesce around a vision for how the technology will play a role, what will that look like in 5 to 10 years? How will the US be using this technology across all of these sectors? That's kind of where we're trying to get to now. But the US, like I said, in our research, the US was last among the 5 governments that we looked at when it came to thinking through a vision for this technology. That said, we do think it's super important for like-minded countries to be thinking about this together. Technology does not know geographic borders. As we've seen with social media and the internet and other technologies, it could be something that originates in one country, but it impacts a whole variety of countries and communities. So we really want to see collaboration between the US and Europe and, with South Korea and other democratic, human-centric societies to create sort of a common vision for what this technology will mean, and yes, the potential harms and how to mitigate. We're, like I said, we're just really at that starting point almost in the US, but XRA has been pushing for a bill which we believe will be introduced before the end of this Congress, so before the conclusion of 2024, that would have our US Department of Commerce basically work with several other government agencies to create a vision, to ask the important questions about this technology and create a vision for how it will impact the US. That bill is called the US Leadership in Immersive Technology Act. And we'll keep you posted, but as I said, I'm optimistic that it will be introduced this Congress. Another key initiative is to have the US Department of Commerce host an international summit with our partners like Europe to think through the governance issues and how we want to address them collectively, rather than doing them in a siloed fashion where the US has its regulation, Europe has its regulation, UK has its regulation. It would be great to bring leaders together to think about this, and sort of in the way that there was a summit, I think it was last summer or fall, on artificial intelligence. So something along those lines. We would like to see the US take a lead in convening that conversation.
That was exactly what was going through my mind, because my question, I hope, like it has a ground in a way, like my perception from as an outsider in US politics is like that US politics is a little bit more in my specific point of view thematic the European ones. Like I feel maybe because we have like a union that is still like growing, that in a way is more fragmented. I feel that when you are in Brussels, you don't hear like one specific topic coming from all countries. Like if you're Italian like me, you have some priorities, and then you listen to European news that is just about the Brussels bubble. But if you go to Germany, where I studied, and when the Charlemagne Prize is, then the priorities are different. Instead, I think when I look at the US, that if there is something like artificial intelligence, that it feels like it is the priority in the moment, it's just about that for a while. And my question is like, do you share that? And also, how do you think, for example, the spotlight put on artificial intelligence impacted, for example, the extended reality part? Because for me, they're sort of like a unicorn, more like super connected, but I think from the outside they don't look like it. So that sort of took away a little bit like the yeah, the spotlight from XR.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I guess it was 2022 was when Facebook changed its name to Meta, and Mark Zuckerberg, was very public about his ambition to create the metaverse or help to create the metaverse. That captured in the US, that captured a lot of attention, and I think it captured people's imaginations. There was a lot of attention paid to it, with a lot of criticism along with it, and questions about um, how this could be harmful to people. We still have problems with social media and online activity, especially with kids and young people. Won't this make it 10 times worse? There was a lot of those types of worst case scenario questions coming at us in 2022. But then when ChatGPT launched, everything became about AI. So I would agree with you that in the US, we do tend to find what we would call the shiny object, and everybody looks at the shiny object for a while and beats it to death. We've spent the better part of 2 years focused on AI. That I would say that I don't want to call it hysteria. It's probably not the right term, but it was a little bit hysterical. Um, that it has quieted down a bit in recent months, and probably part of that is because of our elections coming up, and attention has shifted largely to politics. Um, but I mean, obviously our system is different. We are the United States of America, and each of our states has their own governments and they have their constituent issues. But for the most part, I think people think of themselves here as Americans before they think of themselves as New Yorkers. So that being my example, being from New York. Um, I consider myself an American. In Europe, obviously, you consider yourselves to be European, but you're Italian or you're German, or you're Belgian or what have you. And those countries are part of a union, but they're still countries, independent countries. So I do think there's a different perspective, and I think it's very healthy. That individual countries within Europe are still obviously paying attention to their own interests and their cultures. That's important. But it can also, I could see where it would make consensus more difficult around some issues. So I think, there are pros and cons to each system. But in the US, I would say the dividing lines tend less to be around geography. So it's not like state issues so much as it is political issues. And we have a two-party system here. So it tends to be the Democrats versus the Republicans more than particulars like California versus New York or something like that.
I think like maybe it's just the way I perceive it, but like I feel a little bit like in Europe we have we really have the potential to be like the place for collaboration, because being so many different countries all put together, like we have to collaborate on a daily basis. But then our approach is more perceived like, okay, there is a specific issue that oftentimes, because we have this strong friendship with the US, it's often what you would define as being the key topic in that moment, for example, AI. And then our approach is more about, okay, so we regulate that, because there is also this sort of like public sector component, and then it takes a long time to find consensus around the regulation. And what I think it would be very healthy maybe to set the record straight on this, is that Europe is not just about like regulation. It is like the process that leads to this kind of regulations, like the AI Act, or what we did in the past, like the GDPR. It's usually like a collaborative process with the countries, and sometimes even like with private companies, like with the hate speech. It happened also to like work with the private sector. But I think sometimes what happens is also that there's a little bit of like a sectoriality, maybe I would define it, in the topic that is being tackled. And so with AI, for example, we went on regulating AI, but in my point of view, AI is a part of what will build the metaverse. In the metaverse, you will need extended reality, you will need artificial intelligence and everything. And so we start regulating AI, and we start putting in all of these efforts and strength, just to find ourselves at some point like restricted or confined into this. And I don't think this is just something that is about Europeans. It's more about like a general issue sometime of defining what's really the shiny object that you said in technology sometimes, because we have so many innovations
Yep.
that you really don't know how these are going to play out. Like the other day, I was learning that when it comes to patents, like to make a smartphones, sometimes it's like 200 different patents that go into one smartphone. And sometimes I feel like there is this new thing like 5G, and then we focus on that, and then AI. But the focus would have to be also collaborative in a way, like how these two, like how all these things will play
Right.
out.
Right. I a couple of years ago, I mentioned the Chips and Science Act.
Yeah.
That was it went through various iterations and it had different names as it did. It first started out as the Endless Frontier Act.
Mhm.
Um, Similar bill. That's the first iteration. That's what it was called because it took a couple of years to get the bill passed. But when the Endless Frontier Act was being circulated and XRA was lobbying to try and have immersive technology included, I drafted a white paper on the emerging technology ecosystem. And my thesis was that immersive technology is a critical part of this ecosystem of technologies that is going to shape our future. So I tried to illustrate how immersive technology works with AI, how it works with quantum, how it's impacting biotechnology, all different things like that. Um, and that you raised that point, and I think it's hugely important that these technologies, while you may have specific companies or departments working on a very niche area, in reality, the way it's going to impact society is all of these technologies are going to come together. I mean, already artificial intelligence plays a very big role in how XR is developing and vice versa. People don't realize that XR immersive environments are used to train AIs. So that's just one small example, but all of these technologies will be working together to create products that we use, but also to shape the development of the technologies themselves. So I think that's really important for for everyone to recognize that we can't focus on one thing to the exclusion of another, because all of these technologies are part of this same ecosystem, and it's the ecosystem that really matters.
Yeah, you're definitely right, and it's really interesting that like you came up with that already a couple of years ago. I mean, what we're seeing now is exactly that. It's just that it's something that it's very, I think, very restricted to a specific public. And I also speak to myself because before entering more the tech policy field, I also didn't fully understand how cohesive and how inclusive is immersive technology of other technologies.
Right.
And it's something that I think should be exposed much more. And because of this issue that sometimes we are stuck on one specific topic, and we lose a little bit track of something that's bigger. Like, it's not that AI is not important, it is, but it also needs to be framed in a way that people understand, okay, so AI is important in this context, and if next year we talk about a new innovation, might be still in the same context. It's not like everything has changed within
Right.
one.
Exactly. I think, I mean, I'm just sort of hazarding a guess here, but at least in the US, a lot of the policymakers who are working on law and regulation around these technologies are not tech people. So, you know, members of Congress come from every walk of life. We do have some members of Congress and senators who come from a tech background. Some were tech entrepreneurs. Um, but the vast majority are not tech people, so they may have a more or less sophisticated understanding. So I think, you know, it's my job and others in my field to help educate these people to understand how this is an ecosystem and how these technologies do impact and work together. Um, but we can't expect them to necessarily know that on their own, because, you know, like in our US Congress and the House of Representatives, we may have someone who was a farmer, and someone else who was a doctor, and somebody else who was a school teacher, and someone else who, you know, did human resources management for a company or something like that. All of these people have different backgrounds, and they come to Congress with their life history. Like I said, some of them are very sophisticated in technology, um, but we can't expect that. And I think those of us who are in a certain field or certain industry tend to be talking to ourselves in some respects, like using jargon and taking for granted that someone might understand a concept that is totally foreign to them. So it's important that we continue to help those in the positions who are making these regulations and deciding on policy to really understand what this technology ecosystem looks like.
Yeah, and I think that by doing so, they will probably also help us with like new applications, because I think, for example, speaking with people that work more in the humanities sector that are definitely like not tech people, sometimes they give me hints that I would never think of, because maybe I'm so used to seeing like the same use cases or applications, and then like going back to what we were saying about um like America being maybe a place for like people with like fresher ideas and like a fresh start. When when you speak with people that actually, I wouldn't say know nothing, but they really have like a their head is a little bit of a clean slate of information, they can come up with something that you're like, wow, like I've been.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. It works the other way too, because yeah, sometimes people who are not immersed in the industry um, are seeing things with a fresh pair of eyes, and that can be extremely valuable.
Yeah, like you just like keep thinking over and over about the same things, which makes sense because you have one perspective and I have another, and then people that join this conversation, because right now this conversation is very restricted, it's they're only going to bring like more perspective, but also they're going to enrich the conversation. And I think by doing so, we're going to think of more use cases, more implications for our society. Maybe there is like an XR application to farming that we never thought of, but
Yep.
there's a little bit of like a lack of possibility to express the potential to extend the reality. I think right now sometimes that's the main issue I see.
Well, I think we're making, at least in my experience with Congress, we're making incremental progress. This year, XR was included in a number of very important bills, both authorizations and appropriations of funding bills. For example, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is our funding for all of our defense agencies, there was a reference to XR and a role that it can play. There was another bill that was aimed at nurses and training nurses, because right now in the US we have a shortage of nurses. And XR was recommended as a way to train nurses more efficiently. The Federal Aviation Authorization Act this year referenced XR technology. And there are a bunch of others. In fact, I think it's more than we've seen in any of the past years. So that's great, because some of the language that was included in these bills XR worked on with the various lawmakers, but many of them we didn't. And that to me is the more positive story, because it means that they're thinking of this technology on their own and recognizing its potential. And when they think about what novel technologies do we have that can help solve a problem, now they're starting to think of XR, and that's a real breakthrough. So it will take a while, but I think we're definitely making progress, and I think we'll get there maybe sooner than we even expected.
Yeah, I really think so, especially if there's going to be more possibilities to discuss this, like here in Europe and in the US. I think it's going to be really like an exponential like progress. And in my research, the other sector that I took as a case study was aviation and aerospace that you mentioned, and also you asked me if I'm in space, which is like on point for the sector. I think aerospace was a good example because I wanted to take a sector that was the opposite of tech, like a sector that was always like very strategic and dependent from the public, and that is now finally a bit opening to private.
Right.
And I apologize. I think somebody is like ringing, but to my neighbors, not to me. So yeah,
I didn't
that's
hear.
fine. So what I think about aerospace is that it's very interesting how it's becoming more open to private, but
Yep. Yep.
tech is the opposite. Like it used to be, as you said in the beginning, this sort of like ideal of the teenage coding kid in the garage, usually in California. I don't know why I
Right. No, yeah, Silicon Valley, right.
and then it became like a national, international issue, like policymakers starting to have to deal with these kids that in the meantime they grew up. And I feel like sometimes still the issues like these people, in many ways, they're still like very much like kids. They're like they have a very much like fresh mentality, which I think it's very different from policymakers. Like I understand it in many ways when it comes to some social media, like once they boomed, like you become a businessman and everything. But I think what's maybe missed sometimes is like the fact that many of these millionaires and billionaires, to me, they just still look like very interesting, just very clever guys that you would just have a good conversation with, and they find themselves very big responsibilities in their hands, which I am very sure that they would be very happy to receive some guidance about. I think for me the comparison with the like to have a chat about the US also came from the comparison with the space, which is an unexplored territory. But to me, it's also a little bit like it used to be America. Like now we're shooting like rockets into space the same way we used to have like explorers going to America to see what there was there.
Yeah.
And they tried to look for people in Europe that sort of like protected them in these adventures that they had. And to me, like many innovators that we have right now, they look like this to me. They look like people that have brilliant minds, but they also look to the governments and institutions not as enemies, but as people that can, in a way, work with them and then can give them some type of guidance in this trips to unexplored territories where they're taking us. And so and these unexplored territories are both space and are both like cyberspace. This
Yeah.
is why I think it's cool to put them close. And I think that's why sometimes it's not understood that there isn't really a competition. That is also in the case like completion. Like both of these players really have the same goal in mind, which is about finding a middle ground. Like both the aerospace and the tech sector, they didn't remain completely private or public.
Yeah.
That's also something I found very interesting. Like even the aerospace sector could have remained public. They could have just had, like, even in the US, you could have just had NASA, and that was how it was. But even in that specific super strategic sector, things changed. And even in tech, which used to be like the far west, things changed and the public entered. So I don't think there is anything purely private or purely public where somebody can say like, I am the king of this, and I was voted or I was put CEO, and I don't need the
Right.
help of nobody for this. Like there isn't something like this.
Yep. No, I agree. It's that's part of being a member of society. It's not all public and it's not all private. And it's the more um those two sides can work, and I shouldn't even put them as sides because they're not opposing one another, but the public interests and the private interests can work together and be collaborative. I think that the better it is for everyone. So I agree with you, and I think um it's important that our private sector entrepreneurs especially those who have been like wildly successful, um, that they recognize that there is benefit to be gained from having input from lawmakers and policymakers along the way. And on the other side, that policymakers aren't thinking of billionaires and entrepreneurs as outlaws or something like that. So I think there's a little bit of an adjustment of thinking on both sides, but I agree with you that it would be most efficient and probably yield the best results if we had more public-private collaboration.
Yeah, because also I think in the US, less than in Europe, there's maybe this understanding of like this person made so much money with this idea, and so they can fix things that were like that we have in our society. So why would they come to like a policymaker to ask for help? Like they have so much money. And I think the answer is that the same way even the president of the commission or the president of the United States, the moment they go to a shop, they're a private citizen and they're buying like a product as a private citizen. The CEO of a company that might be making billions, the moment they're going to meet representatives, they're also citizen,
Right.
and like like authorities are still public authorities the same, they still hold the same power to every citizen, like no matter how money they have. So I don't think there is really like um this idea of like you have a lot of money, you can fix this yourself. At
Right.
the end of the day, this person still is somebody looking up to you for
Yeah.
authority. So
Right.
I think that's a little bit the way I see it. And also like I was thinking about this America thing, like these explorers. To me, it's something that's very comforting in a way. It's knowing that there is collaboration between the EU and the US, because even though like I am European and I'm very proud to be European, to me, like knowing that there is a reality that is not European, but is also like a Western society
Right.
with different values, but that I can relate, and at the same time, it's not my reality, but it still look up to, and I am inspired by. I really appreciate that. Like, to me, the US, it's really a place that makes me hope that things that might be more difficult to do in Europe like are possible to be made. And I think maybe it's my perception, but it's the same for Americans, that when Americans look at Europe, they think, okay, maybe in America we have a wonderful country, but maybe our reality could be slightly different, and there is a different type of Western society, and that's in Europe. And this thing is quite complementary.
Yeah. Well, you know, we refer to the Brussels effect here in the US, where um, legislation or regulation that is developed in Brussels often makes its way over to the US via California often. You know, where we're stuck on certain policy or we can't get everybody to agree on something, and particular privacy, online privacy. Um, the states will act independently. California tends to be a very liberal state, and potentially more aligned with a European type model, where I think the public sector has more impact over things. So a lot of times, like GDPR was the basis for a lot of the state privacy legislation in this country. So there certainly is adoption. It's just, I'm sure it's no big revelation for me to say that the U.S. Congress is a little bit dysfunctional these days, so we're not getting as far as we'd like to on particular policy and pieces of legislation, because there's a lot of politicking going on right now. Um, hopefully it will get better. But yeah, we look to Europe a lot, you know, because you're able to move things along more effectively in some respects than we have been. So I think that European model is important. And I would love to, like I said, I would love to see direct collaboration in some of this, because these are, as you mentioned, Western values, Western societies. There's, I think there's certainly room for us to collaborate because we have these common values, and
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, common history.
yeah, definitely. And um, like my question is like, what do you admire of like Europe? Because I was thinking of like this concept that I told you about, like European dream. Like for me, for example, the American dream is about really being unstoppable, like when wanting to achieve something, not having too much of a limitation. Because to me, America really looks like a place where you can have like the wildest dream, and there isn't like too much of yeah, of a boundary to all the things you can imagine, and also to all the things you can achieve if you work hard. So for
Mhm.
me, the American dream is like um dreaming in a way that I think many times in Europe is not even like um is not even practiced. working hard to achieve a goal and not stopping like when you have difficulties. And this is something that I truly admire in American people. Like, what would you define as the European dream right now?
The European dream. That's a tough question. I don't know. I mean, look, I'm from the outside, but to me, it seems like if I were European, the ultimate European dream, I guess, would be to be able to be a part of, to be a citizen of Europe, and also to have pride in my own country as well. So not to have to necessarily choose one or the other. You know, I talked before about being an American, but I'm also a New Yorker. I think, you know, for you being proud of being from Italy and the Italian culture, which is unsurpassed. Let's not even get into the art and the food and the fashion and the cars, everything. It's great. Italy is like excellent. Um, but to be able to be proud of being an Italian and also proud of being a European and not having those things in conflict, to me, that would be the European dream, to be able to be a citizen of Europe and still have pride in your identity as, you know, a German or Italian or French or what have you. Um, I don't know. I mean, technology has been largely a US priority, and I don't think I'm being um, too kind to the US to say that we've been pretty much the lead in technology for the past many decades. But Europe is, in my opinion, is the world leader in culture, in arts, in creativity, in beauty. To be able to bring that to technology is something that would be, I think, uniquely European and would be wonderful for all of us. So that's something I would like to see. I'd like to be able to see Europeans, you know, take their history and their talent and their creativity and just run with it.
You're definitely right. And also, you're right about, yes, Italy is wonderful, it's beautiful. Italians, especially when they're, for example, in Belgium, but also in other countries, they complain about like food or weather. But we're also, I think, especially my generation, very grateful for having been given the chance to live somewhere else that is not our home country,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
like to have more or less like the same healthcare availability, similar education,
yes.
like a lot of homogeneity, but not homogeneity in culture. And this is why I think Europe is so rich, because it's not fragmented when it comes to general services, but it's fragmented like in a way that if you go to Scandinavia, you will not find the same things that you find in Italy or in Belgium.
Right, right.
And when it comes to creating content, for example, educational contents for immersive technology, this is incredible, because you really need to use these technologies for people to explore, like as you said, beauty, and to learn new things. And if we don't have this kind of content, and in Europe we really have content, and I think we also have not just like material material cultural heritage, like paintings and statues and wonderful cities, but we also have that kind of culture that is intangible, like sort of traditions that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And also literature and philosophy,
Yeah,
um, obviously music, all of that. But yes, your cultural traditions, which I think is so wonderful. It's really fun to think about those distinctions. I mean, there are things that are purely Italian and things that are purely French. And it's, you know, it's my heritage is primarily German and British. And I have relatives who came to the United States not that long ago from those countries. And it's, you know, certainly I'm an American first and foremost, but I love the German part of my heritage and the Irish part of my heritage. And um, those things are to be celebrated. So it would be nice to see all of that brought to this immersive world that we're about to enter at
Yeah,
some point. Um, we have been talking for
definitely.
a long time. I have a 3 o'clock meeting, and I didn't realize until I just looked that it's almost 3 o'clock. The
It was,
time just went like that.
yeah, I think it was a very nice conversation. I think it will be very interesting also for people that will be watching this. So that was wonderful. And thank you so much for being here today. That was
My,
really, really lovely.
my pleasure. I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Maybe we can do part 2 at some point.
Would be super nice. Really. Thank you so much and have a good meeting.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thanks to you.
All
Ciao,
right.
ciao.
See you.